Hello everyone, my name is Dariel, this is the Church of Reason, and in this video we're going to be talking about the hidden Neanderthal heritage of Jesus Christ. So strap yourselves in because this one is going to get controversial and we're going to be delving into it, so let's get started. Now, in the Bible, Jesus' heritage can be traced all the way back to Adam and Eve, and so in order to make a connection here, we need to travel back to the days of Adam and Eve. Now, in the story of Genesis, we're told that they lived in the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden is located in the Middle East, in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So, this has led to a major divide between Christians and scientists who place human origins in two different locations. One is in the Middle East between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and one is in the heart of Africa where the earliest human remains have been discovered. So there is contention between the two as to where human origins begins. But if we look at the family tree of human evolution, we can see that in fact there was a people that lived in the Middle East and that this was their origins, and these people were the Neanderthals. So when we look at the Bible and we see that there are people living in the Middle East in Genesis, these people are in fact the Neanderthals of the Stone Age, and that their people had come from that land. That was their origins. So really, the Bible is telling us that there is another origin story. So the contradiction between the two locations of human origins actually coincides with each other when we take into account that the Garden of Eden was in fact a Neanderthal origins. Okay, now if we look at the story of Noah in the book of Genesis, we'll find that he and his sons were the last Neanderthals left on Earth after the flood, and these people would lead to eventually Abraham, who would carry this tradition, these beliefs of the Neanderthals across the rest of the Bible. So if we look at, for example, in the Table of Nations, we'll see that there are many people in the stories that have Neanderthal origins, okay, that share a heritage with Noah, okay. Now, those people are not the only people on the planet. If we look at the Table of Nations, it mentions a bunch of different places and a bunch of different kingdoms, but nowhere does it talk about Egypt. Now, this location in Egypt is populated by other people who have no connection to Noah. And so there are other people on the planet besides just the people who survived in the ark. Okay, so when we look at the Bible, it gives us a very different outlook on where people came from. Okay, so everybody came from different locations and different people groups, and really the story of Genesis and the lineage given in this book is actually specifically to the Neanderthals that survived. Okay, now these people moved across the Middle East, and we can see that they are in fact the true original inhabitants of the region. So this follows in their stories when they are taken into Egypt and they're put into slavery. They have a desire to go to the promised land, and the promised land is in fact the same location where they came from in the first place. Now, what's the evidence for this? Well, in Galilee, the same place where Jesus walked, is a cave where there are Neanderthal bones that have been found. Also in Iraq, right outside of the Garden of Eden, right outside of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, is a place called Shanidar Cave, where at least 10 different Neanderthal skeletons have been uncovered. And these people are the original inhabitants of the Middle East. Okay? And so when the Bible talks about the Israelites and the Hebrews and the 12 tribes of Israel, they are the people who originally lived there, and they have a strong claim to that land. Okay? Now, it's easy to look at history and say, well, you know, didn't the Neanderthals die out? Didn't they? Aren't they all extinct? Well, there's a bit of a problem in science that we can look at. Now, the dating of the Neanderthals dying out is approximately 32,000 years. The trouble is how they get to the point of dating this, okay? Now, a lot of times in Christianity and in other religions, they will just claim that, the radiocarbon dating is faulty or wrong, or they don't believe in that kind of thing, right? Well, the problem is not with the radiocarbon dating or any of the other forms of dating. The trouble is with the information that's gathered by the scientists who make the discoveries. So I'll just give you an example of this. If we find a Neanderthal, right, and we date the skeleton, and it dates to, say, 100,000 years ago, right? Well, then they say, okay, well, the Neanderthals must have lived 100,000 years ago. Obviously, that's true, right? Well, if they find another one and it dates to 200,000 years ago, then they say, oh, well, we're pushing it back to 200,000 years. Okay? But there's no point that they can actually pinpoint and say, this was the last one or this was the first one. So when they say that the Neanderthals died out 32,000 years ago, we know that that's based on a skeleton that they found that dated back to 32,000 years ago. So there's no indication that that was the last one. What are the odds that they found the very last Neanderthal that ever lived? Okay? And science has a way of rigging itself up for failure when it does this. It constantly is running on the information that it has, okay, and it doesn't account for the information that's not been found yet. So this creates a situation where they will constantly be having breakthroughs. Every discovery becomes a breakthrough in science, and this means that the age of the Neanderthals being pushed forward to a more recent time is highly likely, given just logic. Okay, we are bound to find more information about the Neanderthals as we make more discoveries about them. Now, what this means is that when we look in the Bible and we see the 12 tribes of Israel moving across the Middle East and trying to gain control of their land that was taken from them centuries ago, we see that they have a struggle against the rest of humanity. And this is the same struggle that we find with the Neanderthals in the Ice Age, where the humans came into their land and started to mix with them and started to push them out of their territory. This means that the Holy Bible, one of the most revered documents on the entire earth in the history of all humanity, was written by the remnants of an extinct species of human that date back over 400,000 years ago. Now, it's easy to look at the evidence and say, well, evidence is good and all, but what about proof? such a claim needs to have evidence that's substantial, right? Well, there is a three-pronged attack as to proving that this is in fact, truth, okay? The first thing is to look at the Middle East. We need to find more Neanderthal remains in the Middle East, and we need to try to gather the DNA from those skeletons and archive it, okay? Now, the other way of looking at it is to find Israelites that date back as far as we can to as close as we can to Abraham, okay? Now, if we can find those and we can gather the DNA from those, it is possible to find tracers of the Neanderthal DNA inside the bones, okay? Now, it is a fact that people outside of Africa have at least 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genetic code. Now, what we should expect to find when we find the early Israelites, we should be able to find a higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA in them and be able to connect the dots between the Neanderthals that we find in the Middle East and between the Israelites that we find also in the Middle East, okay? Now, the third method is one that has already been pretty much accomplished for finding human ancestry, okay? Now, I believe it was in the 90s that they found a human without actually finding the skeleton that they called mitochondrial Eve. Now, mitochondrial Eve is a concept that's used by the scientific community to point out a person that contributed her DNA to all living people on the earth, okay? Now, this person was a anatomically modern human that was found in Africa. This evidence was used to discredit the Garden of Eden and used to sort of debunk the Bible. Now, when you take into account that the Neanderthals are the true inhabitants of the Middle East and the true people that we find in the Bible, we find that the Bible does have legitimacy. That the Bible actually does not contradict science. That the science actually validates the Bible if we look at the Neanderthal heritage. Okay, now just as they found mitochondrial Eve through the DNA in the mitochondria, which is passed from mother to the descendants. So basically the way this works is your mother's mitochondrial DNA is transmitted to you, and it excludes the father's DNA. Okay, so the mitochondrial DNA is a marker for where your heritage comes from your mother's side, okay? Now, if we find Neanderthal DNA inside the mitochondrial DNA of people living now, we can potentially use the exact same method to trace this back and find true Eve in Genesis, okay? All of these people are people who we would want to excavate their remains and test their DNA and see if they have a higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA than other people that lived at the same time. And if that is the case, then this is all sound proof that the things that I'm telling you are true. And so most of the proof that we require to demonstrate this as a fact is locked up in ancient people's bones, and we have only to go and find them and run the process on them to discover that this is a reality. Okay, so there's one of the things about science is a theory has a higher probability of being true as long as it's falsifiable. In other words, when a theory is presented, they say, well, what would it take for this theory to be wrong? Okay? And what it would take for it to be wrong is merely finding these people in ancient times, these ancient skeletons, and decoding their genetics. And if it turns out that they do not have as much Neanderthal DNA, then that's an indicator that the theory is wrong. Okay? And this is something that can be done, but it's going to require quite a bit of science and quite a bit of research. So this theory has falsifiability, which means that there's ways to disprove it if it's wrong, and if it's right, then it's going to yield more evidence along the way. It's not the kind of thing that there's just one theory and there's nowhere to go from there. This has a future, this has a potential, and we can advance the theory as we go. So this is not by any means the end of the story. This is the beginning of a major adventure in human origins and trying to find our future through our past, okay? And this has major implications, of course, in world affairs in modern times as well. So we should be open to the idea and we should proceed as quickly as possible, because as time goes on, obviously things get destroyed and things get lost. So we're at a prime position where we can find this evidence. This concept is one that very clearly and very soundly bridges most of the gaps between religion and science. And by examining this evidence and by acknowledging the information given by both sides found in the Bible and in the stone and dirt that we find the Neanderthals in, that we can now have a potential to uncover even more mysteries in the Bible and also bring the world together and have more unity and more understanding, a higher understanding than we ever did before about religion and about our place in the universe. The world needs answers. Advancement will cause world peace if we can find the truth, okay? And the answers are going to be found not only in archaeology and paleontology, but in the Bible and holy books around the world, that we can find a truth that's higher than anything we've ever had before. Okay? And the reality is that the things that Jesus talks about, the things that the morals and the message that he brings to the world may come from a time period that is far older than written history. And so the implications are massive, and we need to re-examine the Bible, and we need to change the way we're doing things. Okay, we need to change the outlook. The idea that someone's got a method of learning, a method of understanding, and that's it, is really not good enough. Okay, there's a position in the world that kind of leads to knowledge filtration, where basically, someone finds the Bible, right? And they read it and they say, well, this sounds like it's not true. They say, oh, the flood, well, that didn't happen, right? Discredit the flood, and well, they're not going to read the Bible. They're not going to look at what it says, okay? And they just write the whole thing off and say, I've got a different method. I've got a different way of looking at it. I look at the bones. I look at the earth. I look at, geology. I look at different things like that. And who cares about what a bunch of people wrote forever ago? That's a mindset, you know. And then there's another mindset that says we don't want to look at archaeology. We don't want to look at what's in the earth. We don't like looking at those things because that stuff might contradict the Bible that we believe in. That might contradict the book that we were handed down for thousands of years, and that science is gonna debunk what we've believed all our lives. So why should we look into it? Why should we want to know anything about Neanderthals? What you see in culture today is there's a hard divide where Christians and religious people around the world have no interest in early man, and the evolution of humanity. And there's this knee-jerk reaction that says we don't want to even begin to understand because that contradicts what we believe in. And then you have scientists who say, we don't think that people should learn the Bible because that it fills people's heads with fanciful stories that we don't find evidence for it, and that causes a divide where people are basically cutting themselves off to knowledge that they could find from both sources. And when both sources are used, the amount of information is multiplied, okay? And this is not only true for the Bible and for science, but across the planet with other holy books. There's other ancient texts that talk about things that happened in the past that most historians and mostly secular communities regard as just fantasy and legend, and there's no way it could have happened, and yet we find evidence for it in our world. So why is it that all these people are telling different stories and they have different information, and when it's combined together we have a higher understanding than we ever did? We may have a potential to understand the Bible greater than anyone in the past ever did, from using the science, from using the evidence that we find, from using geology and technology that that we are now exposed to, where we can travel to the Middle East through things like Google Earth, and we can see things from far higher above the planet than we've ever had before. And there is unlimited knowledge that can be utilized to paint a even better picture than we ever knew. If you found this video to be informative, then you can show your appreciation by hitting the like, share, and subscribe icons. And until next time, we will see you.